The smell of a damp muslin cloth folded over a head of lettuce is not something that requires explanation. It simply means someone understood what they were doing. 1953, Burnley, Lancashire. A housewife with a ration book still in the kitchen drawer and a north-facing larder that had outlasted the war moved through her kitchen with the unhurried precision of someone who had never once thrown food away, because throwing food away had never been an option. She tapped the lid onto an enamel bread bin. She set 2 sugar cubes beside the wholemeal loaf. She folded the damp cloth back over the lettuce and closed the larder door without ceremony. She wasted almost nothing. Number 25, wrap a head of lettuce in a damp muslin cloth before storing it, not a plastic bag, not the supermarket sleeve. A cloth, dampened with cold water, wrapped loosely around the leaves and set on the coolest larder shelf available. In kitchens across northern England through the 1940s, this was entirely ordinary practice, noted in Women's Institute circulars and passed between neighbours without a second thought, as automatic as washing a cup. The logic was material. The cloth absorbs surface moisture rather than sealing it in, preventing the cellular dehydration that collapses a lettuce leaf within a single day. Produce stored this way stayed crisp for 3 to 5 extra days. A sealed supermarket bag does the opposite, trapping humidity against the leaf surface and accelerating precisely the decay it appears to prevent. It wilts in 2 days. The cloth cost nothing. Number 24, store eggs, pointy end down. Before refrigerators reached most British homes, the stoneware egg crock sat on the larder shelf with every egg positioned deliberately, narrow tip facing the floor, blunt end uppermost. Village grocers and poultry keepers in rural England through the 1930s and 1940s kept them this way without comment. It was simply how eggs were stored. The air cell inside a fresh egg naturally migrates toward the blunt end. Positioning the egg downward keeps the yolk centered and suspended, protected from the inner membrane, reducing the rate at which the egg deteriorates. Freshness held for up to 3 weeks at larder temperature without refrigeration. The science formally confirming this mechanism was not published until decades after the practice had already been abandoned. Grandmothers across Britain knew it by instinct or by instruction from their own grandmothers in a chain of practical knowledge that reached back well before any laboratory confirmed it. Number 23. Place a lump of sugar in the bread bin. 2 or 3 sugar cubes, set directly beside a wholemeal loaf inside a wooden slatted bread bin, was a domestic ritual with clear roots in wartime northern English households. Referenced in Women's Institute bread freshness guidance from the 1940s and 1950s and repeated in household management manuals of the same period. The mechanism is chemical. Sugar is hygroscopic, meaning it draws ambient moisture toward itself. Set beside a loaf, it pulls excess humidity away from the bread's surface before that moisture can settle and encourage mold. Bread stored alongside sugar cubes in a well-ventilated wooden bin lasted 2 full days longer than bread stored without. It seemed like superstition for generations. Food scientists confirmed sugar's hygroscopic properties decades later in studies that described exactly what those sugar cubes had been doing all along. Number 22. Rinse rice with cold water until the water runs completely clear. In the 1950s and 1960s, as post-war immigration reshaped British home cooking and domestic science teachers in London and Birmingham began incorporating rice preparation into their curricula, this step was treated as non-negotiable, a threshold the cook crossed before anything else happened. The colander under the cold tap, the cloudy starch-white water turning gradually transparent, was a small ritual with a specific and irreplaceable purpose. Surface starch washes away in the rinse. What remains are clean, discrete grains that separate properly during cooking rather than collapsing into a dense, adhesive mass. The texture of the finished rice is transformed. Pre-washed, easy-cook rice arrived in British supermarkets in the 1970s, promising the same result with no effort required. The rinsing habit vanished from most kitchens within a generation. So did the texture. Number 21. Salt sliced aubergine and leave it to drain in a colander for 30 minutes before cooking. Elizabeth David's Italian Food, published in 1954, brought Mediterranean vegetable preparation into British home kitchens with a quiet and lasting authority, and the home cooks who adopted her methods understood that coarse sea salt applied to sliced aubergine was not a suggestion, but a structural step in the recipe. The salt draws out moisture containing bitter compounds. The flesh, patted dry afterward, absorbs dramatically less oil during frying and becomes silky and yielding rather than spongy and sodden. Modern aubergine varieties are now bred and marketed with the claim that the bitterness has been engineered out of them. The oil absorption principle, however, remains unchanged. The trick still works. The 30 minutes still matters. Number 20. Keep butter fresh under a wet, unglazed terracotta pot. In dairy farmhouse kitchens across Somerset and Devon in the first half of the 20th century, and in stories passed through Rural Women's Institute records, butter was kept not in a cold box, but beneath an inverted bell of damp terracotta set in a shallow dish of cool water. The physics were elementary. Evaporation from the surface of the unglazed clay draws heat away from the air beneath it, reducing the local temperature by several degrees and keeping the butter spreadable and fresh for up to 30 days without any mechanical refrigeration whatsoever. The refrigerator replaced this method entirely by the 1960s, and the terracotta pot was put away or discarded. Cold butter that tears bread apart on a winter morning is now the daily frustration of every British household. The pot is still being made. Almost nobody uses it. Number 19. Drop a heel of stale white bread into the pot when boiling cabbage or Brussels sprouts. The Ministry of Food wartime pamphlets, published through the Food Facts series in the early 1940s, were precise about not wasting resources at the stovetop. And domestic science teachers of the era passed on a trick that had already circulated through working-class British kitchens for at least a generation before the war formalised it. The stale bread placed in the boiling water absorbs the sulphurous volatile compounds released as brassicas cook. The smell is reduced. The sharpness in the flavour mellows. The vegetable on the plate is noticeably less aggressive. The trick was forgotten in the decades when boiling vegetables fell out of fashion entirely, and the chemistry behind it was never taught in the schools that replaced domestic science. It was always correct. Then the packaging arrived, and everything changed at once. Plastic wrap, easy-cook convenience products, and supermarket refrigeration entered British kitchens through the 1960s and 1970s, and were received almost universally as progress. Nutrition researchers in Britain would spend the following decades documenting what the transition had actually cost: produce sealed inside synthetic packaging, deteriorating faster than produce stored in breathable cloth and cool air, refrigeration dependency replacing domestic competence, the skills that had governed food management for generations becoming invisible. The tricks had not been superseded by something more effective. They had been replaced by something more profitable, and the replacement had been called an improvement. Number 18. Blanch vegetables before placing them in the freezer. When domestic freezers began appearing in British homes in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Women's Institute home freezing guides published for the new appliance were explicit and unambiguous. Boil the beans briefly in salted water, transfer them immediately to an ice bath in a glass Pyrex bowl, halt the cooking before the texture softens, and only then freeze. The blanching step deactivates the enzymes that continue breaking down cellular structure even at freezer temperatures, degrading color, flavor, and texture during storage. Vegetables blanched before freezing retain their brightness and bite for months. Skipping the blanch and freezing raw became common practice as domestic freezers became familiar and the instructions were no longer read with care. Millions of households discovered their runner beans turned grey and their peas turned mealy. The guide had been clear. Number 17. Rub the pan with a cut onion before frying. On coal ranges in the 1940s and 1950s, before non-stick surfaces had been invented and before Teflon became a household name, a halved yellow onion rubbed firmly across the surface of a dry cast iron pan seasoned it with volatile oils, creating a temporary non-stick effect and preserving the rationed dripping for the actual cooking. Women's Institute cooking demonstrations of the period recorded the technique alongside other fat conservation measures. It required no additional ingredients, no extra cost, and no specialist equipment. Only the onion already in the kitchen and the knowledge of what to do with it. Non-stick Teflon pans replaced the habit in the late 1960s. Then Teflon became its own extended health controversy, and the cast iron pan had already been removed from most kitchens by then. Number 16. Store-hard cheese wrapped in a vinegar-dampened muslin cloth. Village grocers and dairy shopkeepers in Yorkshire and Cheshire through the 1930s and 1940s, and household management manuals of the same era recorded the method plainly as standard practice for any hard cheese intended for longer storage. Malt vinegar applied to muslin, wrapped loosely around a block of mature cheddar or crumbly Lancashire, stored on the larder shelf in cool, dry air. The vinegar's acidity inhibits the growth of surface mold. The cloth allows the cheese to breathe rather than sweating inside a sealed layer. Shelf life extended by 2 to 3 weeks without refrigeration, without cost beyond the vinegar, and without any loss of flavor. Cling film, which seals moisture against the cut surface of the cheese, accelerates exactly the mold it appears to prevent. Number 15. Lay a wooden spoon across the top of a boiling pot. Cast iron pots on pre-ceramic stovetops in the 1940s and 1950s held boiling milk for puddings and soups, and a long-handled wooden spoon placed across the rim of the pot was a standard technique recorded in BBC Home Service broadcast notes and domestic science textbooks of the period. Wood conducts heat poorly. The spoon lying across the pot disrupts the surface tension of the foam building beneath it, breaking the bubble structure before it can rise above the rim and overflow. No wasted milk, no scorched hob to clean, no rationed dairy poured away. The physics function correctly every single time. The trick was abandoned when electric hobs with temperature controls became standard, and the temperature controls introduced their own separate problems. Number 14. Keep a dried bay leaf inside every tin of flour and rice. The larder management sections of household manuals through the 1940s and 1950s included a standing instruction for tin-lidded canisters of dry goods, 1 dried bay leaf placed inside each tin. The volatile aromatic compounds released by the leaf as it sits among the dry goods repel weevils and pantry moths without contaminating the flour or rice with any flavor detectable in the finished dish. Dry goods stored this way remained pest-free for months without sealed packaging, without chemical treatment, and without any expenditure beyond a single bay leaf. Plastic sealed bags replaced open tins through the 1970s and 1980s. Infestations inside plastic packaging are now a routinely documented problem in domestic kitchens across Britain. Number 13. Add a teaspoon of malt vinegar to the water when poaching eggs. Post-war cookery books of the 1950s and early 1960s, in the tradition of writers like Marguerite Patten, who had spent the war years translating domestic necessity into practical guidance, recorded the vinegar step as assumed knowledge requiring no special justification. The acid tightens egg white proteins on contact with the hot water, causing them to coagulate quickly and neatly around the yolk rather than dispersing in ragged white threads through the pan. The result is a compact, well-formed poached egg that needs no metal ring, no theatrical swirling vortex, no specialist equipment of any kind, only a shallow pan, a teaspoon of vinegar, and a fresh, cold egg. The trick was never formally removed from cookbooks. It simply stopped being taught, and within a generation it was unknown. Number 12. Rest a joint of meat beneath a loosely tented sheet of aluminium foil before carving. The Sunday roast in British households through the 1950s and 1960s was a ceremony with a clear sequence, and cookery writing of the period was consistent on the resting step. Once the joint came out of the oven, it waited. The foil tent held the heat close while the muscle fibers relaxed under the redistributing warmth, allowing the accumulated juices to spread evenly back through the meat rather than rushing out onto the carving board in a concentrated pool the moment the knife entered. Every slice retained its moisture. Nothing was dry. Nothing pooled and cooled uselessly on the board. The Sunday joint began its long disappearance from British tables through the 1980s as convenience food expanded and household schedules changed. The resting trick went with it, untaught. Number 11. Reserve a glass of pasta cooking water before draining and use it to finish the sauce. Robert Carrier's Great Dishes of the World, published in 1963, was among the books through which Italian culinary technique moved into British home kitchens during the 1960s and 1970s, and the reserved pasta water step was fundamental to the method. The starch suspended in the cooking water acts as a natural emulsifier, binding the fat in the oil or butter-based sauce with the water and allowing the sauce to coat every strand of pasta in a smooth, coherent layer rather than pooling greasily at the bottom of the bowl or drying out into clumps. Jar pasta sauces require no such finishing step. Millions of British home cooks have therefore never learned what the cloudy water in the reserved glass actually does, or why it works, or that it was known and used in British kitchens before most of those cooks were born. The larder disappeared from British housing plans. This was not a gradual drift, it was specification. Through the 1960s, as new-build council housing was designed to standardized, smaller footprints, the north-facing larder, the cool, ventilated, thermally stable room that had been the structural anchor of domestic food management for generations, was removed from architectural drawings and replaced with a narrower kitchen layout and later with the assumption of a refrigerator. Domestic science, meanwhile, was being quietly contracted in British secondary schools through the 1970s and into the 1980s and 1990s, its hands-on cooking curriculum reframed, reduced, and in many schools effectively cancelled as the subject was absorbed into broader and more theoretical programs. The practical knowledge that had governed British kitchens for a century was not written into any archive because it had never needed to be written down. It was taught by doing in kitchens by people who had learned it the same way. When the teaching stopped, the knowledge did not retire gracefully. It simply ceased to exist in the next generation. Number 10. Wipe fridge shelves with white vinegar on a clean cotton cloth once a week. As the refrigerator replaced the larder through the 1960s and 1970s, Women's Institute household management guides updated their domestic advice for the new appliance and carried forward a maintenance principle drawn directly from larder practice. White malt vinegar on a clean cotton cloth, wiped across every glass shelf, kills surface mold spores and bacteria without leaving any residue. The vinegar smell dissipates entirely within minutes, leaving the shelves odor-neutral and genuinely clean. Cross-contamination between stored foods falls away. Antibacterial spray cleaners replaced the vinegar cloth and introduced synthetic chemical residue onto the very surfaces where open food sits and breathes. Number 9. Stand asparagus upright in an inch of cold water in a glass jug or ceramic milk bottle. Greengrocers in British market towns through the 1950s and 1960s stored asparagus this way as a matter of standard trade practice, and seasonal produce guides circulated by the Women's Institute recommended the same method for home storage in the period before supermarkets standardized produce handling. The cut stems draw water up into the stalk by capillary action. The cells remain fully turgid. The spears stay firm, crisp and sweet for 3 to 4 extra days beyond what dry storage allows. Supermarket asparagus delivered banded in plastic over a polystyrene tray, sitting in a refrigerated cabinet that desiccates as it chills, loses its moisture within 24 hours of hitting the shelf. Number 8. Score the top of a scone deeply with a sharp knife before it goes into the oven. Women's Institute regional baking competitions in the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s were serious occasions judged on precise criteria, and domestic science textbooks of the era treated the scoring step as foundational preparation that preceded every other consideration. The deep crosscut made through the raw dough before baking releases steam as the scone rises, directing the expansion vertically rather than allowing the dough to spread outward into a flat, dense disc. The scored line becomes the clean fracture point that allows the baked scone to be halved perfectly without tearing, crumbling, or requiring force. Ready-made supermarket scones are formulated with leavening agents and stabilizers that make the scoring unnecessary. They do not rise the same way. The difference is not subtle. Number 7. Add a small pinch of table salt to coffee or hot chocolate before adding the water. In the wartime and post-war years, when sugar was rationed and the bitterness of ersatz coffee and powdered cocoa was the daily flavour of British kitchen mornings, domestic newspaper columns and BBC home service household broadcasts carried a consistent instruction: a pinch of salt in the mug before the boiling water goes in. Salt directly suppresses bitterness receptors on the tongue, smoothing the perceived flavour of the drink without adding any sweetness, and effectively stretching the rationed sugar supply by reducing the quantity needed to make the drink palatable. Decades later, a major international coffee chain would market a salted caramel variant as a novel flavour innovation. The innovation had been practiced in British kitchens for the better part of half a century before the branding arrived. Number 6. Keep a wedge of fresh apple inside the brown sugar tin. Household management manuals through the 1940s and 1950s, in their baking sections, recorded this practice as unremarkable and self-evident: a small piece of apple placed among the dark brown sugar in a tin-lidded canister. The apple releases moisture slowly and continuously into the sealed air of the tin, maintaining the humidity around the sugar crystals and preventing the molasses binding them from drying out and setting the sugar into a solid, impenetrable block. Brown sugar stored this way remained soft, fine, and ready to measure without effort. Modern resealable sugar bags represent a marginal improvement on the unsealed alternatives. Brown sugar still hardens in virtually every kitchen in Britain within 2 weeks of opening. Number 5. Cover a bowl with a ceramic saucer rather than cling film. Before cling film arrived in British domestic kitchens following its mid-20th century commercial development and gradual spread into everyday household use, a ceramic saucer placed over a mixing bowl or a pot of leftover stock on the larder shelf was the obvious and standard solution, recorded without comment in household management manuals of the pre-cling film era because it required no comment. The saucer creates a sufficient seal for short-term storage. No plastic contacts the food surface. No synthetic material is used or discarded. The saucer has always been in the kitchen. The cling film box appeared on the counter, and the saucer method was never mentioned again in any domestic guidance published thereafter. Number 4. Turn the oven off 15 to 25 minutes before the dish is due to finish, and allow the residual heat to complete the cooking. Coal ranges and early electric ovens, documented in domestic management guides from the 1940s through the early 1960s, were explicit about residual heat as a usable resource rather than waste. The oven retained significant temperature for a substantial period after the heat source was extinguished, and a lidded casserole dish left inside would continue cooking slowly and evenly without any risk of overcooking, saving fuel and allowing the cook to leave the kitchen entirely while the dish finished itself at exactly the right pace. Energy was not wasted because energy was never taken for granted. The always-on electric hob and the assumption of limitless cheap energy made the principle seem irrelevant through the comfortable decades. Energy bills in 2022 made it feel urgent again. Number 3. Score the skin of a lemon or orange with a knife and roll it firmly under your palm on the counter before cutting and squeezing. Ministry of Food pamphlets on maximizing the use of citrus, circulated during the wartime rationing period when lemons and oranges were genuinely scarce and every drop of juice represented something that could not simply be replaced, described the technique in practical terms without elaboration. Scoring the skin breaks the internal membrane structure connecting the juice sacs. Rolling under palm pressure releases juice from the cells before the fruit is opened. Significantly more juice, by some measures up to 30% more, can be extracted from a single lemon using this method compared to cutting a cold, unworked fruit and pressing it directly. Citrus is inexpensive now and available year-round without restriction. The percentage of juice left wasted inside every squeezed lemon sitting on a British kitchen counter remains precisely the same. Number 2, stand fresh herbs upright in a glass of cold water on the kitchen windowsill rather than storing them in a bag. Kitchen garden writers and allotment society guides of the 1950s and 1960s, in a Britain where fresh herbs came from the garden or the allotment rather than a sealed plastic envelope, described the glass of water method in exactly the same practical terms they used for cut flowers. Clean stems in cold water, indirect light, water refreshed every 2 days. The stems draw moisture up continuously into the plant tissue. The cells remain hydrated and metabolically active. Flat leaf parsley and mint and thyme stored this way stay fresh, fragrant, and fully usable for 7 to 10 days. The sealed plastic bag of supermarket herbs collapses within 3 days on the shelf and within 2 in the refrigerator drawer where most of them end up. The glass on the windowsill costs nothing and lasts more than 3 times longer. Number 1. Taste and adjust seasoning at every stage of cooking, not only at the very end. The domestic science textbooks in the final generations, they were taught seriously and practically in British secondary schools. Before the subject contracted, before the curriculum shifted, before the hands-on cooking lesson gave way to theory and eventually to nothing, recorded this as the foundational act of scratch cooking, the principle beneath all other principles, the habit that made everything else cohere. The wooden tasting spoon dipped at the beginning when the onions soften, dipped again when the stock goes in. Again at the halfway point, salt drawn into food at each stage builds flavour from within the cellular structure of the ingredients rather than sitting on an external surface applied too late to penetrate. The layered depth that results from seasoning throughout a long cook cannot be reproduced by salt shaken over a finished plate. It is a different thing entirely. Professional kitchens never lost this understanding. It was not removed from professional culinary training in any reform or curriculum revision. It was lost only in the home kitchen, the kitchen where every one of these tricks was born, where they were practiced without names or labels, where they were embedded in daily routine so completely that no one thought to write them down because no one imagined a world in which they would need to be written down to survive. That world arrived anyway. The enamel bread bin is gone. The stoneware egg crock is on a shelf somewhere, decorative now. The muslin cloth is folded in a drawer that does not open often. The larder was removed from the housing plan before most people alive today were born. A single glass jar sits on an empty kitchen shelf and catches the last of the afternoon light through the window, holds it for a moment, still and clear. And then the light shifts and the shelf is just a shelf and the jar is just a jar and the kitchen is quiet.